Johnny Carson was arguably the best and most beloved American talk show host of all time. His unique brand of observational humor and snarky wittiness, combined with his cordial demeanor, resonated with audiences and critics alike. But Johnny Carson's life was a lot more eventful and intriguing than a lot of people realize. He had a persona his fans expected to see, and it's not abnormal for stars to be different from the characters they play on TV. That same principle applies even to celebrities who become famous for portraying themselves. Join Factsverse as we take a look at the real Johnny Carson, the man he was when he wasn't hosting his hit program, The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson's childhood was fairly mundane. John William Carson came into the world October 23, 1925. He was born in Corning, Iowa, to parents Ruth Elizabeth Carson and Homer Lloyd Kit Carson. His mother was a typical homemaker, while his father worked as a manager for a local power company. Later on, it came to light that Johnny Carson wrestled with very active personal demons. He was notorious for being a heavy drinker, philanderer, and for having a short temper. In his adult life, these issues caused him serious problems, both in his personal and professional life. Although she no doubt did the best she could, Johnny blamed his domineering mother for some of his troubles. He once referred to his mother Ruth as Lady Macbeth, the toughest of them all. And his relationship with her was apparently quite toxic. They were on such bad terms that reportedly when she passed away, he didn't attend her funeral, and quipped that the Wicked Witch was finally dead. Little Johnny grew up in the somewhat remote towns of Avoca, Red Oak, and Clarinda in southwest Iowa before his family relocated to Norfolk, Nebraska when he was 8. While there, he grew up discovering his passion for entertaining others. When he was 12, Johnny discovered a book on magic and sleight of hand at one of his friends' houses and proceeded to buy a magician's kit through the mail. After receiving his kit, he began honing his entertainment skills by performing simple card tricks for his family members. His shtick was to follow his siblings and parents around and ask them to pick a card, any card. Even though he would later come to resent her, Johnny's mother wanted to support her son and encourage him to follow his passions. So she sewed him a cape. His first performance was at the local Kiwanis Club, where he made his debut as the Great Carsoni at age 14. From there, he went on to refine his routine, performing at local picnics and county fairs. Once he graduated from high school, he hitchhiked to Hollywood, where he was subsequently arrested and ordered to pay a fine for illegally impersonating a midshipman, although this tale has been called into question over the years. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like, and subscribe to Factsverse for more, and stick around for a lot more about Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson joined the military before scoring his big break. During World War II, Johnny enlisted in the Navy. While he was in the service, he engaged in regular amateur boxing tournaments and apparently was quite good at the sport. When he was in the Navy, he had a 10-0 record and participated in the most fights fought on board the USS Pennsylvania. But even though he was a capable and gifted fighter, he still retained his passion for stage magic. One of the highlights of his military career, or at least the one he said was most significant to him, was the time he performed magic for the United States Secretary of the Navy, James V. Forrestal. When the secretary asked him if he planned on staying in the Navy after the war, Johnny responded by saying he didn't plan on it and instead wanted to be a professional magician. After performing for the tough-as-nails, no-nonsense military career man, that's when Johnny realized he had the ability to entertain someone as crotchety and sophisticated as Forrestal reportedly was. When the war ended, Johnny dedicated himself to pursuing a career in entertainment by studying journalism at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with the intention of one day becoming a comedy writer, but later he switched his major to speech and drama to instead take a stab at being a radio announcer. Even though he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in radio and speech, he eventually moved away from radio and transitioned to television. After many twists and turns, Johnny took over as host of the late-night talk show Tonight. Previously, that show was helmed by Jack Paar. While the show was already fairly successful by the end of the 60s, Carson became a bona fide American icon during the 70s and retained that status even after retiring in '92. Johnny's casual yet conversational approach with his star-studded guests was unparalleled. He's seen even now as the reigning king of late-night TV, and it's undeniable he influenced hosts that have taken the helm of his and other similarly themed shows. Johnny Carson kept much of his personal life private. Johnny was many different things. Not only was he a comedian and wildly successful talk show host, he was also a father of 3, as well as a 3-time divorcee. But even though he lived his life perpetually in the limelight, he rarely let the public know the details of his family life. He was a deeply private man, and the on-screen version of himself was pretty much the only one his fans got to see. Johnny was very careful to keep his private life carefully under wraps, and his friends, lawyers, and fixers also assisted him in keeping details of his life out of the tabloids. But there was always much speculation he was a much darker person than the one we got to see on TV. While most people saw Johnny as a kind, loving Midwestern boy who was gifted at taking command of the stage, others argued he was shy, deeply insecure, cold, and calloused. In truth, he was all these things, the good with the bad. It wasn't exactly a secret how Johnny would treat his guests between commercial breaks. He was often called cold-hearted by those who had the opportunity to sit down and chat with him on his popular show. It was said he would often lose his cool over small things, and many suspected his relationship with alcohol is what contributed to his volatile mood swings. Johnny Carson was a very nervous and awkward man off-screen. Even though Johnny effortlessly made small talk with his guests on The Tonight Show, he could be very anxious and socially awkward in real life. Despite being known as a suave debonair on screen, when the cameras weren't rolling, he struggled to make conversation. To ease the tension, it's said he would carry a deck of cards with him and do magic tricks when he was anxious. One of his fellow TV hosts, Dick Cavett, even said he felt sorry for Johnny because of how socially uncomfortable he was. Johnny Carson's love life was tumultuous. Johnny had a pretty lousy reputation of treating people who annoyed him fairly poorly. Apparently, it wasn't very difficult to wind up on his bad side either. One person who did was Johnny's 4th wife, Alexis Moss, who put up with constant public humiliation when she'd say something that would irk her husband when they were on her honeymoon. The two spent the honeymoon in Italy in 1987. By all accounts, it was a pretty miserable affair because even though they were traveling on Johnny's luxury yacht, his mood quickly degraded. Reportedly, when Moss made a fairly innocuous comment that annoyed her new husband, he shot back at her, commenting that even though they'd been married for only 3 weeks, if she were to say something like that again, their union wouldn't last another 3. The two actually remained married until Johnny's death in 2005. Since then, however, Moss has remained out of the spotlight, and it's unknown whether she dated anyone else since Johnny. But even though Johnny's 4th marriage endured for many years, his previous marriages shined a bit of light on his character. When in the midst of divorce proceedings with his 2nd wife, Joanne Copeland, it was revealed Johnny's alcoholism was at the heart of their marital troubles. It was also revealed Johnny was deeply insecure and routinely suspected Copeland of cheating on him. When it was discovered Copeland had a secret apartment where she was engaging in a clandestine affair with another man, Johnny's dark side came out in a disturbing way. Not only did he raid Copeland's apartment without her consent, but he also fell into a downward spiral of alcoholism, self-hatred, and depression that was nearly impossible to keep a secret. The fallout from this chapter would lead to him having a deep distrust for anyone, especially women. Here's Johnny. Johnny Carson was a household staple for over 3 decades. From 1962 to 92, he brought his cool persona, sharp wit, and lovable demeanor into our living rooms. He felt more like an old friend. Carson was the veritable king of late-night talk. Whether you were a fan of Letterman or Leno back in the day, or Jimmy Kimmel or Conan O'Brien today, they've all taken cues from Carson, who was the clear ground layer for the entire genre of late-night talk shows that are now a staple of evening television. Despite being a comedic beacon of the small screen and having such a cheery, approachable personality that drew in a very diverse audience, Carson was apparently not the same man off-screen as he was when the cameras were rolling. Turns out, he had long-standing grudges and feuds that wouldn't be put to rest, including one with Bob Hope, who happened to be a frequent guest on the show and even a guest host for several episodes. We're going to show you some little-known facts about one of the greatest talk shows of all time. Stick around until the end of the video to find out about Johnny's shocking feud and falling out with Joan Rivers. You won't believe why the two friends abruptly became enemies. Facts Verse presents Secrets of the Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. But first, before we dive in, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Tapping the bell icon turns on notifications so you never have to miss another one of our eye-opening videos. Johnny gets his start. The Tonight Show got its start in 1954 with Steve Allen behind the desk. That torch was passed over to Jack Paar, who took the helm of the late-night talk show between 1957 and 62. It was initially filmed at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in Manhattan and ran from 11:15 all the way until 1 a.m. That time slot would later be cut down to 60 minutes. After Parr's last show in 1962, there was a 6-month gap before Johnny Carson had his first episode on October 1st. In that first episode, his guests included the singer Rudy Vallee, actor and filmmaker Mel Brooks, singer Tony Bennett, and the lovely Joan Crawford. What a lineup. Carson set the stage for years to come. Even though the idea of a late-night talk show wasn't a new one, the format that Johnny Carson laid out with his own take on the show was revolutionary. The same basic structure is still followed to this day, with The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. When the work you did still lives on 60 years later through many incarnations, it's safe to say you've left behind a strong legacy. Carson always started out each show with a stand-up monologue that consisted of about 24 one-liners. He avoided sounding played out and stale by never saying more than 3 things about a specific subject. Then there were always a few sketches and guest interviews where he talked to some of the hottest people in the realms of entertainment, politics, and even the sciences. The show always wrapped up with a musical performance or a stand-up routine from one of comedy's greatest. If that formula sounds familiar, that's because every late-night talk show host since then has followed the same basic pattern for decades. Carson's producer helped him become who he was. Fred DeCordova became the producer of The Tonight Show in 1970. He was promoted to the position of executive producer in 1984. Cordova worked with some of the greatest comedians and actors in the industry. Carson and Cordova's relationship would become strained in 1991 when Carson was taking extra long to finish an episode. He was honoring the life of his son Richard, who had just died in a vehicular accident. Cordova gave the sign to Carson that he needed to wrap it up quickly and that he was taking too long. This was met with the fury of Carson, who banned him from the set for the rest of the show's run until it ended in 1992. Cordova retained his title of executive producer, but he and Carson's relationship would never be the same. The most frequent guest star. Even though it's well known that the two had a bit of an ongoing feud, no one had as many guest appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson as Bob Hope. In fact, he had over 100 guest spots on the show despite their ongoing differences. Carson definitely wasn't a huge fan of the iconic comedian, but because of Hope's special relationship with NBC, he could basically come on the show whenever he felt like it. It was this presumptuousness that made Carson feel sour towards Hope, who he never felt like was a particularly great entertainer or guest. Johnny did have respect for Bob Hope's place in showbiz, but he just didn't care much for his work as a whole. Both Hope and Carson were well loved by NBC and America's viewing audiences, but they were frequently at odds with each other. Perhaps it was because their personalities were so similar. Both men were easygoing, fashionable, admirable, and hilarious comedians, but also a bit emotionally distant. Carson preferred spontaneous and naturally flowing comedy and had a disdain for Hope's prepackaged, scripted delivery. As time went on and Hope advanced in age, he eventually lost much of his hearing, forcing the two to stick to a script when they were on stage together. Carson once commented on this fact rather sardonically, saying, "If I ever end up like that, I want you to shoot me." A wide range of guests. In the early days, Carson had all the prolific politicians of the day on his show, including RFK, Hubert Humphrey, and even Richard Nixon. By the 1970s, he focused less on politics and more on the entertainment industry. The show continued to follow this new formula for the rest of its tenure. He was always a diplomat. He very smartly remained politically neutral during his monologues, interviews, sketches, and comedy routines, in fear of taking a side and alienating his huge audience. Johnny had an endless stream of uber-famous guests. George Carlin, Drew Barrymore, Robin Williams, Joan Rivers, Jerry Seinfeld, Drew Carey, and Gary Shandling are just a few folks that saw monumental gains in their respective careers from appearing on Carson's stage. Johnny kept it all business. As chatty and friendly as Johnny Carson seemed when the cameras were rolling, he would rarely go out of his way to socialize with his guests before or after the show. This business-only mindset would even be extended to guests he had known for many years. It kind of makes sense, though. He spent several hours a day having to talk to folks and portray this persona that everyone had come to expect. It has to be a bit overwhelming to be that familiar face every single day, especially on your off days. There was one particular time that Johnny broke his own rule and went out of his way to greet a guest before the show, much to the shock and awe of his staff. That shocking event took place on September 23, 1976, when Hollywood legend Orson Welles was his guest. Carson was a huge fan of the Citizen Kane star and had to make sure he got a word in with him before the taping. Carson had pencils with erasers on both ends. Johnny was quite the fidgeter. He always needed something in his hands, and his objects of choice were good old-fashioned pencils. Apparently there was some concern from producers that these sharp, pointy objects could prove to be dangerous, either to Carson himself or one of his guests. So just in case any pencils went flying and suddenly became a harmful projectile, his staff swooped in and replaced all his regular writing implements with pencils that had erasers on both ends. It's a good thing Carson was more of a talker than a writer. From New York to the Golden Coast. Even though the show was originally filmed in front of a live audience at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City, it made the jump from the Big Apple to the West Coast in 1972, when NBC moved production to Burbank, California. The show continued the rest of its tenure there until it finally came to an end in 1992. Special guest hosts. Johnny Carson had quite a few friends that stood in as a guest host when he needed a break. Joey Bishop was his most frequent guest host and appeared 177 times. Joan Rivers hosted 93 times, and John Davidson and Bob Newhart both hosted 87 times. Other notable backups were David Brenner, McLean Stevenson, Jerry Lewis, David Letterman, and even big-name stars like Frank Sinatra, Burt Reynolds, and Sammy Davis Jr. Joan Rivers was his permanent guest host in the early 80s, and Gary Shandling was the choice pick for 1987 and 88. Jay Leno was then his permanent guest host, rounding out the final years of the show before the torch was passed to him. Joan Rivers and Carson's falling out. As we already mentioned, Joan Rivers was a significant player on The Tonight Show. She was a frequent performer, guest, and host. In 1986, however, Rivers took the job as host of The Late Show, which was Fox's offering in direct competition to The Tonight Show. Carson was furious. He felt betrayed by Rivers because she never informed him of her intentions to join the show, and she never asked him for his seal of approval. Their relationship came to an abrupt end. Even in 1991, when Carson's son passed away in that car accident, and Rivers felt it fitting to send Johnny a loving letter expressing her condolences, Carson snubbed her. Like we said before, he was well known to hold grudges. Another feud happened in 1981 when Frank Sinatra asked Carson to host Ronald Reagan's inaugural gala. Carson felt like he was being unfairly pressured into doing the event, and then later on he found out it was Reagan who was making the request, but that he sent the request through Sinatra. The divide only grew from there, and to add insult to injury, Dean Martin showed up to the event absolutely hammered, which pushed Carson's buttons even further. We could go on and on about The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. It was one of the finer pieces of late-night TV to ever hit the airwaves. Born in Detroit, Michigan, Edward Leo Peter McMahon Jr. was the son of Edward McMahon Sr., a fundraiser and entertainer, and Eleanor Russell McMahon. During his childhood, he lived in Lowell, Massachusetts, and often visited his paternal aunt, Mary Brennan, at her house on Chelmsford Street. He spent 3 years working as a carnival barker in Mexico, Maine, and also worked as a bingo caller at age 15 in Maine. To pay for college, he sold vegetable slicers on the Atlantic City Boardwalk. His first job in broadcasting was at WLLH-AM in Lowell, which led to his TV career launch at WCAU-TV in Philadelphia. He wanted to be a Marine Corps fighter pilot, but before the U.S. entered World War II, the Army and Navy mandated that pilot applicants complete at least 2 years of college, so he went to Boston College from 1940 to 41. The college requirement was so important that it stayed even after the attack on Pearl Harbor. After fulfilling that requirement, he embarked on his primary flight training in Dallas, followed by fighter training in Pensacola. He earned his carrier landing qualifications and his naval aviator designation. He served as a Marine Corps flight instructor in F-4U Corsair fighters before being assigned to the Pacific Fleet in 1945. But his orders were revoked after the atomic bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's unconditional surrender. After the war, he took advantage of the GI Bill and attended Catholic University in Washington, D.C. He graduated in 1949, majoring in speech and drama. As a tribute to his contributions towards the National Guard and Reserves, he received an honorary commission as a brigadier general in 1982. Marriages. Ed McMahon's love life was as varied as his career, filled with whirlwind romance and heartache. He exchanged vows with Alice Farrell July 5, 1945, while serving as a flight instructor in the Marines. Their union brought 4 children into the world, but their love story came to an end, and they separated in 1972, with the divorce finalized in 1974. But he found love again and married Victoria Valentine on March 6, 1976. Together, they adopted a daughter, Catherine Mary, in 1985. But destiny had other plans for them, and the couple divorced in 1989. McMahon provided a staggering $50,000 per month in spousal and child support. In a twist of fate, just 3 months before his Tonight Show journey concluded, McMahon found love once again and married 37-year-old Pam Hearn in a ceremony near Las Vegas on February 22, 1992. Pam brought her son Alex into the family, and McMahon's daughter Catherine proudly stood by their side as the best person at the wedding. Financial woes. Ed McMahon, a generous individual who has given much to others, lost his Beverly Hills home to foreclosure after owing approximately $644,000 in payments after a nearly $5 million mortgage loan. Additionally, American Express secured a judgment against McMahon for nearly $750,000 in unpaid bills, and a Washington-based company called Hicks Inc. claimed he failed to repay a $51,000 loan. In total, McMahon, who earned millions over his 50-year career, was in debt for almost $1.5 million. How could this TV legend find himself in such financial turmoil? His representative, Howard Bragman, believed McMahon's financial difficulties resulted from a combination of failing health, a mismanaged economy, and a bad housing market. A significant factor contributing to the iconic sidekick's financial downfall was his large heart. According to David Fisher, who collaborated with McMahon on his autobiography, For Laughing Out Loud, and his latest book, When Television Was Young, McMahon was an incredibly generous person, often to his own detriment. Fisher added that Ed loved making people happy. He enjoyed carrying cash around, much of which went towards tips. Additionally, the TV legend spent a substantial amount of money supporting his third wife Pam's clothing company. Although the designs were well received, sold at Saks Fifth Avenue in Neiman Marcus, and even worn by celebrities like Paula Abdul and Sharon Stone, the high-priced fashion line eventually fizzled out. While money continued to be spent, there was little income coming in. Surprisingly, McMahon, who was Johnny Carson's sidekick for 30 years, revealed he didn't receive residuals from the successful DVD box sets of The Tonight Show. Additionally, the 85-year-old had been unable to work since breaking his neck in a fall in 2008. Fisher shared a story about how, just a day or two after McMahon's injury, he chose to honor his commitment to review the manuscript for When Television Was Young instead of going to the hospital. Career beyond Tonight. While Johnny Carson built his fame around Tonight and retreated from the spotlight after retirement, McMahon chose a different trajectory. Over the years, he hosted several shows, including the Kraft Music Hall in 1968 and the talent competition Star Search. McMahon also co-hosted the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Association Telethon, a Labor Day weekend staple, and partnered with Dick Clark for TV's Bloopers and Practical Jokes. Together, they became the faces of American Family Publishers sweepstakes, appearing on contest entry forums and TV commercials. McMahon was also well known for his ongoing Budweiser ads. He played supporting roles in various films, such as Fun with Dick and Jane and Just Right, and took on his first regular TV series role in the 1997 WB sitcom The Tom Show, starring Tom Arnold. In 1998, he published his autobiography For Laughing Out Loud, My Life and Good Times, detailing the origins of Tonight. McMahon wrote that before the first show, Carson told him, "Let's just go down there and entertain the hell out of them," which was the only advice he ever received from Carson. Health complications and death. In the midst of a seemingly glamorous life, darkness loomed over Ed McMahon's health. On April 20th, 2002, McMahon filed a lawsuit against his insurance company for over $20 million, claiming he and his wife Pamela became ill due to toxic mold that spread throughout their Beverly Hills home. The mold allegedly resulted from the improper cleanup of water damage caused by a burst pipe. The suit, filed in LA County Superior Court, also implicated members of the McMahon's household staff and held the mold responsible for the death of their family dog, Muffin. At the time, the lawsuit was one of several cases related to toxic mold that had been brought to court in recent years. The defendants named in the suit included American Equity Insurance Co., multiple environmental cleanup contractors, and a pair of insurance adjusters. On March 21, 2003, the lengthy legal battle concluded with McMahon being awarded $7.2 million from the various company deemed negligent. In March 2007, he suffered injuries from a fall, and in 2008 it was revealed he was recovering from a broken neck and 2 subsequent surgeries. He later filed a lawsuit against Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and 2 doctors, alleging fraud, battery, elder abuse, and emotional distress. On February 27, 2009, news surfaced that McMahon had been hospitalized in an undisclosed LA facility, later identified as Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, for nearly a month. He was listed in serious condition and admitted to the intensive care unit. On June 23, 2009, he was declared dead at the UCLA Medical Center. His nurse, Julie Coney, RN, mentioned he passed away peacefully. Although no official cause of death was provided, McMahon's publicist attributed his passing to the numerous health issues he had experienced during his final months. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers, a pioneering comedian, enjoyed a warm professional relationship with Johnny Carson for years, often appearing on The Tonight Show and even serving as a guest host in Carson's absence. Her sharp wit and comedic style were well received by audiences, and her rapport with Carson was evident. However, their relationship soured in 1986 when Rivers launched her own late-night talk show on the then-new Fox network, becoming a direct competitor to Carson. The rift was not merely professional. Carson felt personally betrayed, as Rivers didn't inform him of her show before the network announcement. Rivers was subsequently banned from The Tonight Show, a ban that remained in place until 2014 during Jimmy Fallon's tenure as host. The ban and her show's eventual cancellation were significant professional setbacks for Rivers, though she managed to rebuild and sustain her career. Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, the legendary singer and actor, had a complex relationship with Johnny Carson and The Tonight Show. While Sinatra did make appearances on the show, it was widely recognized that Carson felt uneasy around him, partly due to Sinatra's reputed connections and formidable demeanor. The tension was palpable, and Carson was often more reserved and cautious during Sinatra's appearances. Although Sinatra was never officially banned, Carson's reluctance to engage with him was evident, and as a result, his appearances on the show were limited and often mediated by mutual friends like Dean Martin. Bob Hope. Bob Hope, a beloved actor and comedian, was a frequent guest, often dropping by to promote his specials. However, Carson grew frustrated with Hope's tendency to leave immediately after his segment without watching other guests, which was considered disrespectful. While Hope was never officially banned from the show, there were periods where his appearances were notably sparse. Despite this, Hope's career, deeply rooted in his status as a beloved entertainer, remained largely unaffected. Howard Stern. Radio personality Howard Stern's relationship with The Tonight Show and Johnny Carson was notably contentious. Stern, known for his provocative and no-holds-barred style, was banned after making several appearances deemed disrespectful and inappropriate. His comments and behavior on the show, which included making sexual innuendos and disparaging remarks about Carson and other celebrities, led to his ban. Stern's career was not significantly impacted by the ban. Louise Lasser. Actress Louise Lasser's ban from The Tonight Show followed a peculiar and widely discussed appearance in 1976. Lasser, who was experiencing personal challenges at the time, delivered a performance that was considered one of the most bizarre in the show's history. Her disoriented demeanor and refusal to leave her dressing room initially almost led to her segment being canceled. Carson was reportedly unhappy with the appearance, leading to Lasser's ban. She continued to work in the industry, maintaining a career that wasn't defined by this singular incident. Sinead O'Connor. Irish singer Sinead O'Connor, known for her haunting voice and bold personality, encountered controversy related to the show when she refused to appear on an episode that also featured comedian Andrew Dice Clay. O'Connor cited Clay's often misogynistic and crude humor as being in direct opposition to her feminist belief, leading her to cancel her scheduled performance. While Johnny was known to avoid conflict, this act of rebellion against the show's booking, and by extension its host, was not taken lightly. O'Connor was not a frequent guest following the incident. Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase had a somewhat tumultuous relationship with Johnny and the show. Initially, Chase was a welcome guest and even a guest host on the show. However, the relationship soured partly due to Chase's own late-night show, which was a direct competitor, although it was short-lived. The rivalry and subsequent tension between the two, both professionally and personally, led to Chase being unwelcome on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. Kathleen Turner. Actress Kathleen Turner was reportedly banned from The Tonight Show after making comments Carson found disrespectful and unappreciative. Turner, who had been a guest on the show, allegedly made remarks in subsequent interviews that downplayed the significance and impact of appearing on the show, which didn't sit well with Carson. While Turner was a celebrated actress, the ban did limit her exposure to the vast audiences The Tonight Show provided. Sylvester Stallone. Stallone, known for his roles in blockbuster films like Rocky and Rambo, was allegedly banned from The Tonight Show after canceling scheduled appearances. The cancellations and perceived lack of professionalism and respect for the show and Carson led to Stallone being unwelcome on the show. But given Stallone's stature as a prominent actor in Hollywood, his career was not notably impacted by the ban. Sandra Bernhard. Comedian and actress Sandra Bernhard found herself banned from The Tonight Show after making off-color remarks and engaging in behavior deemed inappropriate and disrespectful by Carson and the show's producers. Bernhard, known for her edgy and provocative style, reportedly crossed lines that Carson was uncomfortable with, leading to her ban. Despite this, her career, which often embraced controversy and boundary pushing, continued in films, television, and stand-up. Johnny's temper. Johnny Carson, while celebrated for his smooth, calm demeanor on the show, was known to have a different disposition behind the scenes, particularly in his personal relationships. His issues with temper and emotional expression have been documented and discussed by biographers, colleagues, and friends, revealing a complex person behind the affable television persona. Carson's temper reportedly affected his relationships professionally and personally. He was known to be firm and at times unyielding. Some guests were banned following those disagreements or perceived slights, showcasing Carson's willingness to assert boundaries and uphold his standards and expectations. In a personal context, Carson's relationships, particularly his marriages, were notably impacted by his temper and emotional complexity. He was married 4 times, and his marriages were often characterized by turbulence and challenges. His issues with anger and emotional expression were cited as contributing factors to the difficulties and eventual disillusions of his marriages. Carson admitted to struggling with emotional expression, and those close to him often spoke about the dichotomy between his public and private personas. Despite his issues with temper and emotional expression, Carson maintained numerous long-lasting relationships in the industry and was widely respected by his peers. His legacy in the industry remains significant, though discussions about his temper and personal relationships provide a more nuanced view of the late-night legend. Who was Carol Wayne? Carol Wayne was born in Chicago, Illinois in September 1942. She spent most of her teenage years as a figure skater alongside her younger sister Nina. The girls even joined the Ice Capades together. While they succeeded as skaters, they dreamed of something even more glamorous. Carol and her sister also began their showbiz careers together. They were showgirls at the Tropicana Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. This show gave the sisters exposure, but it wasn't enough to get them where they wanted to be. They moved to Hollywood, a choice that began both of their acting careers. Carol Wayne had innocent eyes, an enviable body, and an innocent charm complemented by her high voice. This made her a natural fit in the entertainment world. She was discovered at a Hollywood party. She later auditioned for The Tonight Show and got the part. Her life and career. Carol Wayne became a frequent fixture on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. She appeared in over 100 of the show's sketches before her death. One of the most popular was Tea Time Movies with Art Fern, where she played the matinee lady. The role led to a short period of blissful success. But Carol's life turned upside down when Johnny Carson threatened to quit The Tonight Show in 1980. He insisted he would only stay if the show's length was cut from 90 minutes to 60. NBC reluctantly agreed to his demands to save their biggest moneymaker at the time. The time reduction seemed like a fitting compromise for everyone involved at first. It helped the network and kept Johnny on set. The problem came when the change started to affect Carol's career. It left less time for the Art Fern sketches and other show staples Carol had appeared in. Her career began to decline without this steady pool of work to rely on. When roles wouldn't come, she was forced to do personal appearances to earn money. Carol's net worth at the time of her death was $2 million. This may seem like a lot of money to the average person, but it's a paltry sum compared to the fortunes of most other film and TV stars. Her declining finances eventually became such a serious issue, she filed for bankruptcy in 1984. That same year, she posed for Playboy in a bid to get her career back on track. This effort unfortunately failed. She struggled to find roles and allegedly became addicted to drugs and alcohol. Carol did her best to find as many parts as possible despite personal setbacks. She was a frequent guest star on game shows like Celebrity Sweepstakes and the Hollywood Squares. Her charisma and beauty worked as well on these types of bright stages as it had on The Tonight Show. Whether she would have earned these parts without the influence of their producer, who became her second husband, is debatable. Carol had a few small TV appearances outside The Tonight Show and the world of game shows. She found parts in shows ranging from serious dramas to popular sitcoms. She acted alongside Robert Culp in one of the most popular episodes of the 1965 show I Spy. She also appeared on episodes of Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie. Carol earned a few roles in films including The Party, Every Man Needs One, Scavenger Hunt, Gypsy Angels, and The Big Black Pill. Her final film appearance was in the 1984 film Heartbreakers. It was a box office flop that failed to restart her career. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure you give it a like, and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content. Carol's romantic life. Carol Wayne's career wasn't the only area of her life that didn't go how she planned. She struggled to find true love despite her beauty and charisma. She was married 3 times. Her first husband was Loretto Larry Serra, an unknown in the world of Hollywood. Her next husband was Barry Feinstein, a rock and roll photographer. They had her only son, Alex, together. Her final husband was Burt Sugarman. He was a well-known producer who brought her into the cast of Celebrity Sweepstakes. Like most relationships in Hollywood, none of these marriages lasted very long. Carol was tied to another man, Edward Durston, at the time of her death. Her death. Almost all female actresses get teased about something, especially when they sign up to work on a talk show. What's unique about Carol Wayne's case is that jokes about her age and appearance foreshadowed her mysterious death. Carol told Johnny Carson he was old in an episode of The Tonight Show on October 2, 1973. He responded by saying, "Someday you'll be 47, and she replied, "I hope so." Unfortunately, she died at age 42. There was also a running gag in the world of Hollywood that Carol Wayne's breasts were so large and buoyant they'd keep her from drowning. This ultimately proved untrue at the time of her death. Reports say Carol went on vacation with boyfriend Edward Durston on January 10, 1985. They left for a relaxing trip to the beach in Santiago Bay, Mexico. They had an argument a few days into their trip. Carol went for a walk on the beach to calm down. Edward checked out 3 days before her death. He left her luggage at the airport with a note saying she would come pick it up later. A local fisherman named Abel de Dios found her body in the shallow bay waters. The police still wonder what it was doing there in the first place. A full autopsy was performed. While it didn't answer every question, it eliminated a few possible explanations. Carol's body had no cuts or abrasions. This meant she couldn't have fallen off the nearby rocks or injured herself in any way that led to her death. Her body also tested negative for drugs and alcohol. This proves these substances didn't have any part in her demise, despite early rumors of her addictions. The police surmised Carol Wayne must have died while on her walk alone. Her death was ruled accidental, but there are still several unanswered questions surrounding it. Unsolved mysteries. The FBI Uniform Crime Report says approximately 40% of all homicides go unsolved. Hollywood stars aren't immune to this statistic, and many rulings about their deaths leave unanswered questions in the minds of their adoring public. Carol's case left plenty of unsolved mysteries as well. No one was there to witness it because it most likely occurred while she was on the beach alone. That means there's no one who can vouch for the truth of the current ruling on her death. One of the first and most mysterious circumstances surrounding the case involves the depth of the water. Carol didn't know how to swim, but drowning in 4 feet of water while fully clothed still seems suspicious. There were no signs of force or illegal substances, so could someone have forced her head under the water until she drowned? It's also a bit odd Carol chose to go near the water at all. She couldn't swim and was hydrophobic. Going for a walk on the beach is understandable, but why would she go into the water of her own free will? If Carol's death wasn't an accident, the obvious question is who murdered her? Was it her boyfriend or someone he hired? Was it a random assailant? The case of Carol Wayne's death is closed, so the truth may never be discovered. Edward Durston, the only other person connected to the event, can't give any further testimony. He died in 2007. There's been no proof that Edward was involved in Carol's death in any way. The fact that he checked out 3 days before her body was found may make him seem less suspicious, but events in his past have the opposite effect. Edward was connected to other tragedies years earlier. He was with Art Linkletter's daughter when she jumped out a window in 1969. He was also an acquaintance of a victim of the Manson murders. Reports about and investigation into Carol Wayne's death began in Mexico and eventually spread to the rest of the world. U.S. Consular William Lecoq said in a statement he considers the case unsolved. He feels there are details the police missed about this blonde beauty's demise. Today, Carol Wayne joins the company of other stars like Marilyn Monroe, Natalie Wood, and Elizabeth Short. They all died under mysterious circumstances that left the public wondering what happened. Johnny's first marriage. Johnny Carson's first marriage was to Jody Walcott, and their union began long before Carson rose to fame. Johnny and Jody first met in college at the University of Nebraska, where they both attended. The couple tied the knot October 1st, 1949, when Carson was just 24. At that time, he was working as a radio announcer in Omaha. Carson's career began to take off, and he moved to California, where he found success as a TV personality. But the pressures and demands of his burgeoning career took a toll on his marriage. Jody, who preferred a quieter and more private life, found it challenging to adapt to Carson's increasing fame and the public scrutiny that accompanied it. The strain on their relationship eventually led to their separation, and they officially divorced in 1963 after 14 years of marriage. Despite the end of their romantic relationship, they remained on amicable terms and continued to support each other throughout their lives. After their divorce, Jody maintained a low-profile life away from the public eye. She remarried and largely stayed out of the spotlight. Carson, on the other hand, went on to become a TV icon as host of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, where he entertained audiences for 3 decades until his retirement in 1992. Ultimately, his first marriage set the stage for the subsequent chapters of his life, including his subsequent marriages and unparalleled success as one of the most beloved and influential figures in late-night television. But despite the failure of the marriage, it did produce 3 children. His first son, Richard Carson, was born October 14, 1950. Richard led a relatively private life and chose to stay away from the spotlight. He pursued a career in music and became an accomplished jazz musician. Carson's second son, Christopher, was born in 1952. Like his older brother, he also preferred to maintain a low profile. He pursued a career in television production and worked behind the scenes rather than in front of the camera. Carson's youngest son, Corey, was born June 20th, 1953. Tragically, his life was cut short when he passed away on June 21st, 1991, at age 38 due to a car accident. Corey's untimely death was a tragic loss for the family, and it deeply affected Johnny. Throughout his career, Johnny was fiercely protective of his children's privacy, ensuring they were shielded from the media and public attention. Johnny's second marriage. Carson found love once again and walked down the aisle with Joanne Copeland August 17, 1963. Joanne, a former model and interior decorator, brought a new chapter of companionship and support into Johnny's life. Their relationship seemed promising, and they appeared to be a well-matched couple. Copeland's beauty and grace complemented Carson's wit and charm, making them an attractive pair both on and off screen. During their marriage, Carson's career continued to soar. Copeland embraced her role as the supportive spouse, standing by her husband's side as he became an iconic figure. However, despite the initial promise of their union, the pressures and demands of the Carson's high-profile career once again proved challenging for the couple. The long hours, constant public scrutiny, and seductive allure of showbiz took its toll on their relationship. In 1972, after nearly 9 years of marriage, Johnny Carson and Joanne Copeland parted ways. The decision surrounding their separation and subsequent divorce has remained relatively private, with both parties maintaining a level of discretion. Copeland retreated from the public eye, choosing to focus on her personal life. Johnny's third marriage. Johnny embarked on his third marriage with Joanna Holland, a former model and socialite. After the dissolution of his second marriage to Joanne Copeland, Carson found love once again and tied the knot with Holland September 30th, 1972. She brought a fresh energy and sophistication into Carson's life. Known for her beauty and vivacity, Holland added a touch of glamour to the relationship. The couple's marriage lasted for a decade, during which time they navigated the ups and downs of Carson's high-profile career and the accompanying pressures. Despite their initial connection and the public image of a picture-perfect couple, their relationship eventually encountered difficulties, and they separated. In 1983, after 11 years of marriage, Johnny and Joanna officially divorced. The specifics have remained private, with both parties maintaining discretion. Following the divorce, Holland sought to maintain a relatively low-profile life, and of course Carson continued on as host of The Tonight Show. Johnny's fourth marriage. Johnny Carson's fourth marriage proved to be his most enduring and meaningful. He found true love and companionship with Alexis Moss, a former stockbroker. Their relationship blossomed and they exchanged vows on June 20th, 1987. Alexis became an integral part of Carson's life, providing unwavering support and love throughout their marriage. Their bond was evident to those who knew them, as they were often seen attending events together, sharing laughter, and supporting each other in both good times and challenging moments. Moss proved to be a constant presence in Carson's life, particularly in his later years when his health declined. As Carson faced various health issues, including emphysema and ultimately his battle with lung cancer, Moss was there by his side. Her devotion and unwavering commitment to Carson's well-being were apparent as she took on the role of his primary caregiver, ensuring he received the best possible care. Carson's declining health necessitated a more private life, and Moss respected his desire for a low-key existence. She shielded him from the public eye and allowed him to enjoy his retirement years in relative seclusion. As Carson's health continued to deteriorate, Moss became his rock and constant source of support. She remained devoted to him until the end, ensuring he was comfortable and surrounded by love. Carson once famously described her as the love of his life, a testament to the profound connection they shared. After Johnny's passing, January 23, 2005, Alexis continued to honor his legacy and the bond they had built. While she preferred a private life, her unwavering dedication to Carson remained evident, and she played an integral role in preserving his memory. She provided love, care, and companionship to him during the final years of his life, solidifying her place as a pillar of support and the person he cherished most. Interestingly enough, Alexis came from an incredibly wealthy family and was a socialite and heiress long before she and Carson met. So there were never any claims that their love was based on his success or his money. And while she certainly did inherit much of his wealth, some sources claiming she was worth around $300 million in 2018, she actually ended up giving a ton of it away to charity. Reportedly, she gave nearly $156 million to the Johnny Carson Foundation. This generosity was no doubt linked to her upbringing and the positive influence Carson had on her. She was able to continue his legacy and keep showing her devotion and love to him by making such huge donations in both of their names. Mindy's tribute. Don passed away April 6, 2017, and Mindy penned a lovely and heartfelt tribute to her dad 5 years after his death. In it, she spoke of his talent, love, and abilities as a father. She also touched on his relationship with Johnny Carson, who at the time was just about the biggest name in showbiz. She mentioned her dad was booked by The Tonight Show more than 100 times over the course of Carson's time at the show's helm. It's a remarkable number, and one that exhibits both the level of talent Rickles had, as well as Carson's unending respect for the comedian. Mindy wrote that her dad long held Carson as one of the two primary people, the other being Frank Sinatra, who he credited with making his career as successful as it was. She revealed that both Carson and Sinatra adored Don, and that they loved the fact that he would make fun of them just as much as anyone else. She also talked about how the first time Sinatra and his crew showed up at one of Don's shows, Don took a huge risk and poked fun of Sinatra's image as being backed by the mafia. According to Mindy, Don said to Frank and his crew, "Make yourself at home, Frank, hit somebody." And luckily for Don, Frank and his buddies found the joke hilarious. Mindy also talked about how Don was able to get away with his trademark brand of insult comedy. She said that even as people were being mocked to their face,
they took it in stride because they could always sense that Don was a lovely, warm person. They could tell he was doing it just as an act and that he meant no serious offense. That, Mindy admitted, is why Johnny Carson ultimately gave him the nickname Mr. Warmth. And that nickname stuck. Don and Frank. A big part of Don and Frank's relationship was having fun with each other and pulling pranks. Don got the better of Frank one evening when Don was on a dinner date and Frank was at the same restaurant. Don's date reportedly refused to believe that the insult comedian was a close friend of Sinatra's. So Don got up and pulled Frank aside at some point and asked for a favor. He asked Frank to come up to his and his date's table and begin making conversation to show the two were friends. According to Frank's later telling of the story, when he approached the table and introduced himself to Don's date, Don snapped at him, "Can't you see I'm eating, Frank? What are you doing?" Frank admitted to being fully taken by the prank and stood there with his mouth open. But he soon got back at Rickles for this little jab. One night while Don was performing at the Sahara, Las Vegas, Frank decided he was going to have Don Rickles arrested in the middle of one of his performances. So, in the middle of Rickles' set, two uniformed police officers arrived on stage, dragging him off and out of the venue. They put him in a police car and hauled him away. Only instead of taking him to the station and booking him, they dropped him off at another casino, the Sands. There, he discovered Frank at a table, gambling, surrounded by beautiful women, and joined by Dean Martin. Frank reportedly smiled, looked at Don, and said, "Anything wrong, Don?" Rickles knew immediately he'd been pranked by his good buddy. Despite their constant prank war, the two remained friends until Sinatra's death in 1998. Don Rickles acted as one of the fallen star's pallbearers. Don and Bob. Another of Don's closest friends was legendary comedian and actor Bob Newhart. Despite different comedic styles, Rickles and Newhart found a common ground in their shared appreciation for each other's abilities. Their friendship was built on admiration, camaraderie, and a shared understanding of the intricacies of making people laugh. Throughout their careers, Rickles and Newhart often appeared together on television shows, including numerous guest appearances on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. They also performed together at various comedy events, showcasing their natural chemistry and ability to play off each other's comedic timing. Their onstage collaborations were a delight, as audiences witnessed the comedic brilliance of two great talents in perfect sync. Offstage, they enjoyed spending time together, exchanging humorous stories and engaging in lively conversations. Their close friendship provided a source of comfort and inspiration as they navigated the ups and downs of showbiz. They would travel together, and whenever Rickles thought he had offended anybody in the audience, he would, according to Newhart, feel pretty awful. The two remained fairly close over the years. They would even attend each other's family vacations and tours together, even though Rickles offended Bob's wife, Ginny, the first time they met. While at the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas, Bob and Ginny sat in the front row to watch Don perform. Although Newhart warned his wife about Rickles' reputation for harsh jabs, she apparently wasn't prepared enough when Rickles proclaimed that the, quote, stammering idiot from Chicago was in the audience with his hooker wife from New Jersey. Despite that pretty awkward moment, Newhart always knew Rickles was a good guy at heart, so when Rickles died in 2017, Newhart honored his friend's memory by sharing with The Hollywood Reporter that the comic didn't have a mean bone in his body, and that it was an honor to be picked on by him. Don's legacy. Don Rickles' legacy as an entertainer is nothing short of legendary. With his quick wit, biting humor, and unparalleled ability to captivate audiences, he left an indelible mark on the world of comedy. He showcased his unique talent and became known as the ultimate insult comic. One of the defining aspects of his legacy was his fearlessness on stage. He targeted everyone, including celebrities and audience members, with his sharp-tongued insults. However, his charm and infectious personality endeared him to audiences, allowing him to push boundaries and bring laughter to people from all walks of life. He was a versatile entertainer who excelled in various mediums, including film, TV, and music. His fearless approach to comedy and ability to connect with audiences in a way that was both hilarious and endearing has inspired countless entertainers who have followed in his footsteps.
Johnny Carson allegedly had a license to be lewd. According to friend and co-host Ed McMahon, the late and beloved talk show host Johnny Carson had a special license for being lewd with his female guest stars that was granted to him on account of his disarming Midwestern charm. Ed McMahon shared he thought his former boss did and said things during his tenure as host of The Tonight Show that his less charming contemporaries wouldn't have gotten away with, especially with such high ratings. But as Ed put it, Johnny knew exactly where to draw the line, so his disarming demeanor wouldn't be enough to keep his guests from feeling uncomfortable. Some of the many guests Johnny nearly crossed the line with include Dolly Parton, Lucille Ball, Betty White, Sophia Loren, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and Madonna. Each time, the talk show host thankfully managed to keep audiences and his guest on his side by curtailing his behavior at just the right moment. Johnny Carson and Dolly Parton. Johnny Carson's infamously lewd interview with country music legend Dolly Parton happened in 1977, when the country singer was still a relatively new sensation. Johnny, of course, had been holding his seat as host of The Tonight Show for well over a decade at that point. As soon as Dolly came on set and sat down beside Johnny, it became instantly apparent that the host was interested in much more than the singer's music. Dolly has always been known for being just as much a sex symbol as country star, and the icon has never been a stranger to the male gaze. Because of this, Dolly likely wasn't too offended by what Johnny did and said during her first interview on The Tonight Show. The host continued to bring the interview into adult territory. Eventually, he proclaimed to Dolly, seemingly in earnest, that he would be willing to pay an entire year's salary to see her naked bosom. Dolly simply laughed the joke off at the time, but later she revisited the experience by making a joke of her own, claiming she would pay to take a shower with Johnny. While audiences may balk at Johnny's behavior in that interview with Dolly nowadays, it doesn't seem as if the country singer was very offended by his behavior. In fact, it seems Johnny and Dolly maintained an amicable professional relationship following that initial interview. Johnny Carson shocked his old friend Lucille Ball. Several years before the Dolly Parton interview, Johnny performed an interview with television legend Lucille Ball that was arguably even more problematic. They had been friends for many years before this interview and remained friends afterwards, so audiences both then and now have understandably taken the interaction with a grain of salt. The interview was going well until Lucille asked Johnny if there was anything the talk show host was curious about regarding her that he didn't already know. Johnny replied by asking Lucille how old she'd been when she lost her virginity. Lucille gave a seemingly authentic look of shock, and Johnny laughed and claimed that the shocked reaction she gave was exactly what he'd been looking for. Betty White and Johnny Carson. Johnny was also a good friend of Betty White's. Not only would he often have her on The Tonight Show as a guest, but he would frequently bring her on to perform sketches alongside him. These sketches, including one where the pair played Adam and Eve, for some reason always seemed to involve both comedic actors being naked. Because of this, Betty White would go on to joke that Johnny simply called her up every time he wanted to take his clothes off. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like, and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. And stick around for more inappropriate things Johnny Carson did to his female guests. Johnny made Sophia Loren turn red. In 1979, Johnny had the good fortune of hosting Italian actress and venerated sex symbol Sophia Loren as a guest. Of course, Johnny wasn't going to go the whole interview without shooting his shot with the beloved female icon, and he did so in classic Johnny fashion. Towards the beginning of her appearance, which otherwise consisted of another run-of-the-mill interview, Johnny Carson pulled out a box and gifted it to the actress. When she opened it, it was revealed to be a red garter. Johnny then claimed he heard Sophia considered the color red lucky, so he wanted her to have a red article of clothing with her during the interview. Why he chose a garter is anyone's guess. Sophia seemed relatively unfazed by being granted this sexually charged item of clothing and returned the favor by offering the talk show host a small red bag of salt she kept on her for the exact same purposes. Apparently, Johnny's intuition had been right, and his gift of the red garter had made it so Sophia no longer needed her lucky red salt bag. Once again, it seems Johnny's charm magically allowed him to interact with a female guest in a way that would have been inappropriate for anyone else. Madonna taught Johnny what a bustier was. By the time pop singer Madonna made her talk show debut in 1987, Johnny was coming towards the end of his 3-decade-long tenure as host of The Tonight Show. According to Madonna, she specifically chose to pop her talk show cherry with Johnny Carson, and she did so in spectacular fashion. When she showed up for her interview, she did so wearing exposed lingerie. Johnny was understandably taken aback, though seemingly in a good way. Over the course of the interview, the talk show host went on to question the singer about her odd choice of clothing. At first, he seemed to think maybe it was a progressive fashion top that she had designed herself, but she explained it was just run-of-the-mill lingerie she had purchased at the store. Johnny asked what the name of the item was, to which the singer replied it was a regular bustier. It took Johnny over 25 years of hosting The Tonight Show to finally learn what a bustier was, and he never forgot the experience. The Zsa Zsa Gabor pussy petting story. Is it true? Besides all these incidents on The Tonight Show that have been documented, Johnny Carson also allegedly had a ribald interaction with Zsa Zsa Gabor that involved a cat the actress brought with her to an interview. According to legend, Zsa Zsa asked Johnny if he wanted to pet her pussy, to which the talk show host replied he'd love to, but there was that cat in the way. The internet seems to love to deny that this interaction ever occurred, but where there's smoke, there's fire. Jane Fonda confronted Johnny about the Zsa Zsa Gabor rumor during an appearance of her own on The Tonight Show, and Johnny claimed he had no memory of such events ever unfolding. But even if the story is untrue, the beloved talk show host certainly said and did plenty of things during his 3-decade tenure that raised some eyebrows. The origin of Johnny's Midwestern charm. Johnny was born in Iowa in 1925 and developed a passion for performing at a young age thanks to mail-in magic kits he collected as a kid. It was while serving in World War II that Johnny began to enjoy making people laugh, entertaining both his peers and higher-ups with jokes. After the war, he moved to New York City in the hopes of becoming a performer. By the late 50s, he'd begun hosting the game show Who Do You Trust? It was while working on this series that Johnny developed his professional relationship with co-host Ed McMahon. Johnny Carson was host of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, for 3 decades, from 1962 to 92. Over that time, he had a wide variety of guests. Many who appeared on the program were burgeoning comedians who received their first mainstream fame thanks to performances on the show. Some of the most notable figures who caught their big breaks thanks to Johnny Carson include Jerry Seinfeld and Joan Rivers. And Carson often featured A-list stars like Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope. Throughout Carson's time at NBC, the host grew to be one of the most bankable stars at the network. But he never quite grew to surpass legendary comedian Bob Hope in stature. Bob was always one step ahead of Johnny at the NBC offices, having previously occupied the stage Johnny used for his time on The Tonight Show. According to legend, Bob could essentially book himself on The Tonight Show whenever he wanted. Bob would often request an appearance on the show when he had a new special to promote. When Bob asked for the opportunity, Johnny understandably accepted. But it now appears as if Johnny never enjoyed having him on. Sadly, it appears as if the on-screen relationship between Johnny Carson and Bob Hope was completely fake. Johnny actually despised the comedian and only allowed him on the show so often because he felt he had no other option. There were numerous reasons Johnny disliked Bob Hope, and he grew to dislike him even more as the years went on. By the time Johnny had finished his tenure on The Tonight Show in 1992, he had arguably grown to dislike comedian Bob Hope more than any other guest. One of the biggest reasons Johnny couldn't stand Bob was that Bob was completely incapable of improvisation. Johnny was quick on his feet and liked to have spontaneous banter with his guests. Given that Bob was a legendary comedian, one might have assumed the celebrity figure would have had some wit of his own. But it appears this wasn't the case. Even at Bob's physical peak, it appears he had to rely on his team of comedy writers to come up with anything funny to say. In his later years, his reliance on his writers grew to the point where he had to rely on them to even understand what was going on. Unlike Johnny Carson, who retired as soon as his health started failing, Bob pushed beyond his years and continued performing when he barely could. Due to Bob's lack of improvisational skills, Johnny grew to consider the legendary comedian to be a bad guest. But he continued having him on because he felt he couldn't turn him down. Johnny grew incredibly bored of the comedian's scripted routines and resented the fact that Bob's stature at NBC made it so he had no ability to deny his requests to appear. Often Bob Hope's appearances on The Tonight Show would be staged to appear spontaneous. But according to Johnny, there wasn't a single thing about the comedian that was actually spontaneous. These fake surprise appearances would typically result in Bob rattling off a few scripted jokes and making way for a reel of footage from an upcoming special. According to Johnny Carson, these reels would often be poorly cut and much longer than Bob had initially promised. This was another thing about Bob that rubbed Johnny the wrong way. One time, Bob was a guest on the show and noticed the audience was laughing exceptionally loud at the host's monologue. This led Bob to ask Johnny if he could use some recordings of the laughter as the canned laughter on his upcoming special. Johnny agreed, but was once again taken aback by Bob's forwardness. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Facts First for more, and stick around for more about Johnny and Bob. Bob Hope's appearances on The Tonight Show were irritating for Johnny Carson at the best of times, but they became even more annoying for the host once the legendary comedian's health began failing. If Bob had a hard time improvising at peak health, the act proved completely impossible during his later years. According to Johnny, Bob would have no idea what he was talking about unless the host stayed completely on script. If Johnny read the wrong question from his card, Bob was liable to give the answer to a completely different question. Seeing Bob in this state was one of the reasons Johnny chose to retire before his own health began failing. According to legend, Johnny turned to his crew after one of Bob's later performances and told them to shoot him if he ever ended up like that. Bob Hope was certainly one of the most frequent guests The Tonight Show ever had, but he's not the only frequent guest who rubbed the host the wrong way. Another frequent guest was Joan Rivers. Johnny and Joan memorably developed a feud over the decades of Johnny's tenure. Joan had gotten her big break performing on the show with Johnny as a host, and their chemistry had been a big hit. After Joan's initial appearance on the show, its host memorably made the comment he thought Joan Rivers was going to become a star. Joan certainly did, and continued appearing on the show for many years. It got to the point where Joan was called in whenever NBC needed someone to replace Johnny Carson, whether he was on vacation or just not feeling well. So you might assume Joan was actually close friends with Johnny. Sadly, it appears Johnny and Joan's on-screen chemistry was once again a facade for the cameras. Johnny treated Joan like a business asset, and the two never developed a true friendship when the cameras weren't rolling. When Joan Rivers was given an opportunity to host her own show in the 80s, Johnny went to war with the comedian. According to the late Joan Rivers, the reason Johnny was so mad was that she was a woman. Johnny put out the word that anyone who appeared as a guest on Joan's show wouldn't be allowed on his. Because of this, Joan's show ended up failing very early on. Though she found later success as a daytime talk show host, she never again returned to hosting late-night television. In fact, she couldn't return to The Tonight Show until shortly before her death, when Jimmy Fallon had taken over. Jay Leno had been Johnny's replacement, and he refused to let Joan on during his time out of respect for Johnny. While feuds are typical in Hollywood, the stars involved in them will often let them go as they're lying on their deathbeds. But this wasn't the case for either Johnny or Joan. Johnny went first, and he and Joan never patched things up. In Joan's last years after his death, she never changed her tune and continued saying disparaging things about the late talk show host. According to Joan, Johnny had been her professional mentor, and he had acted very unprofessionally when he started the ridiculous feud. On the other side of the coin, Don Rickles was a frequent guest who managed to stay on the beloved host's good side. Like Bob Hope, Don was a legendary comedian who often appeared on The Tonight Show, but the visits were always met with a warm reception by Johnny Carson. Not only did Johnny find Don Rickles authentically funny, but he also had no problem improvising with the comedian and developing interesting comedic banter. Now it's time to hear from you. Did you know Johnny couldn't stand having Bob Hope as a guest? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.